In addition to establishing market institutions to underpin markets, governments need to intervene to influence behaviour by market participants, and they need to provide so-called non-market services, and these things have been already talked about. While much of this intervention has been desirable, some of it has come at a high cost and has been motivated by private interests rather than the public interest. And that has been the object of the reform process from the 1980s. So we've seen a trend to the removing of impediments to competition, as well as a shift from public to private sector provision, where it's more efficient or more cost effective. And in financial markets, we've seen a greater emphasis on principle-based regulation focused on outcomes rather than prescriptive regulation focused on inputs, with more reliance on disclosure and the strengthening of overarching institutional oversight. Now, while this shift has yielded significant benefits for Australia, and our financial regulatory framework is generally seen as very robust, the global financial crisis's origins in regulatory failures overseas, together with Australia's membership of the G20 and that grouping's increased role, has meant that we are inevitably facing pressure to introduce tighter regulation in Australia. Well, that's not a bad thing. We need to continuously review regulation, particularly in areas as important as financial markets, in the light of experience. But managing this process so as to ensure that any new regulation we do introduce is appropriate to Australia's circumstances and a good fit with the existing regulatory framework will be quite challenging. There's much at stake in getting this right. Financial flows are the lifeblood of the economy. Prior to the liberalisation for the 1980s, financial markets in Australia could be said to have been very safe, but credit was costly, hard to get and poorly allocated. The relaxation of credit controls and barriers to competition drove major innovations in cost reductions that boosted economic growth and benefited many people, including low-income people. Any response in Australia to the recent excesses and poor risk management in the United States should not overlook these important benefits. They imply the need in intervening in this market to get a balance between reducing the risks and costs of financial instability and the contagion effects that can have on the real economy, and the risks and costs of reducing competition, innovation and the productivity of this key sector, and the adverse economy-wide impacts that these two would have. Well, while some areas look more prospective than others, this is Ken Henry's territory and others' territory, and the Commission hasn't done any work that would inform useful insights from me today on these very complex issues. But the challenges in getting the balance right in regulating markets, including financial markets, are illustrated by two areas that the Commission is looking at right now. One, which has its origins partly in the fallout from the global financial crisis, is executive remuneration. The other is gambling, or the gambling industries. In both, our task is to come up with a regulatory framework that bridges what is seen as a clash between the private and social values and interests in order to get better outcomes for the community as a whole. And I think both provide, hopefully, some wider lessons. Well, executive remuneration first. As many of you will know, that inquiry was triggered by a community backlash against instances of large multi-million-dollar payouts to CEOs at a time when shares were plummeting, companies were performing poorly, and many Australians were doing it tough. Many of these were characterised as payments for failure, and very healthy payments at that. CEOs were seen as feathering their own nests and taking actions to achieve that which were too short-termist or that were heightening risk, and in particular contributing to the financial problems that eventuated globally. This was a conflagration from what actually had been a smouldering issue in Australia for some time. From the early 90s through to about 2007, we saw executive remuneration for the top 100 companies treble, rising from 17 times to 50 times average weekly earnings, and indeed up to $10 million on average, or 150 times average weekly earnings for the top 10 companies. This has been seen as both inequitable and efficient, seen as the market for executive remuneration, or the public companies that surround them being effectively out of control. And so governments were, I guess, on the back foot to step in and place limits on this process, including caps on remuneration. At the time when the inquiry was announced, they indicated that they were going to do that in one key area that was very contentious, and that was termination payments, as you'd be aware. But at the same time, they announced two reviews, one by APRA, which was focused specifically on the finance sector, given the contagion risks that I talked about there, and secondly, the one by the Commission, which looked at executive remuneration generally, but particularly outside the finance sector. Well, by now you've seen where the Commission came out with its report, or at least you've read about it. We found that there were deficiencies warranting additional regulation, but as indeed with APRA, we saw the importance in the regulatory actions that needed to be taken of strengthening decision-making within markets rather than overriding the market with controls on outcomes, which we saw as potentially having high costs and risks. The facts are that there are 2,000 public companies in Australia. The multi-million-dollar pay packets that get all the attention are largely confined to the top 1 or 2%. Big pay is mainly a big company story in Australia. As I indicated, the top 10 CEOs have average pay packets of $10 million or more, but the bottom 500 have remuneration of around $180,000, or only 3 times average weekly earnings. And even the top CEOs were found not to be highly paid, believe it or not, by international standards. Their remuneration is well below that in the USA, which admittedly is an outlier internationally, and was found to be closer to the remuneration of CEOs in the smaller European countries, and again well below that in the UK. Remuneration, executive remuneration, also varies considerably by sector, where we've seen no opening of the divergence with average earnings in the mining sector, for example, where the divergence has been quite great in the finance sector. And while there was very rapid growth in executive remuneration in the roaring 90s, that slowed in the 2000s, with total remuneration falling by 13% in 07-08 and by about 20% in 08-09 in response to the impacts of the global financial crisis. In its research, the Commission found that for every 10% increase in the size of a company, according to its market cap value, CEO pay rises by 4%. And that was a very consistent finding across countries. Bigger companies pay more to compensate for greater job complexity and the greater ramifications of decision-making in that job. Large companies compete for the best people because even a little difference in the quality of decisions or the strategic judgments that are made could mean millions of dollars worth of additional profit or returns to shareholders. Well, it's understandable, nevertheless, that there's a sense of disbelief or even grievance in the community at the headline numbers that appear in the newspapers relating to executive pay, particularly for those top 1 or 2%. And I think we'd all agree, or most of us would agree, no doubt, that many of those CEOs and highly paid executives are earning more than they need. But the question for policy is whether what they're earning is excessive from an economic efficiency perspective.